Hello and welcome to this podcast on the causes of the American Civil War. The second topic is that of the election of 1860 and the aftermath. The immediate cause of the American Civil War was the election of Abraham Lincoln and the Republican Party in 1860. First, a little background. If you've listened to my previous video on slavery as a cause of the American Civil War, you will know that one of the Republicans' main reasons for existence was the elimination, or at least restriction, of slavery into new territories. This was bitterly opposed by the slaveholding South, who had most of their wealth based on the practice of slavery, and saw the restriction of its expansion as eventually killing it. The Republicans also stood for the support of big business, especially railroads and factories, and expansion of small northern farmers into the western states, without the competition of slavery. All of these were mainly northern interests. On the other end of the spectrum were the Democrats. The Democrats were the oldest party and had existed since their founding by Andrew Jackson in 1820. However, by this point, the Democrats were highly regionalized and highly pro-slavery, as much of their moderate northern wing had become Republicans after the collapse of the Whig Party in 1856. Despite this, the Democrats still hoped to be a competitive force in the North after a good showing there in 1856, and the only way they would try to achieve this was by nominating a moderate. They also had the double-edged sword of incumbency. On one hand, the current president, James Buchanan, was a Democrat, and thus had some campaign infrastructure. However, he had become hideously unpopular amongst both Northerners for being too pro-slavery, having signed off on things like the Compton Constitution and supported the Dred Scott decision, and amongst Southerners for not being pro-slavery enough, for instance agreeing with the idea of popular sovereignty. Thus the Democrats decided to ditch Buchanan as a candidate and nominate a new one. In the end, this proved to be their undoing. The Democrats chose to put their convention in the worst possible place, Charleston, South Carolina, a notorious hotbed of secessionists who tried to influence the convention and may have been partially responsible for the walkout later on. The problem with the convention itself was that there appeared to be no clear candidate. While the largest number of delegates at the convention voted for the moderate Stephen A. Douglas, he failed to reach an actual majority due to the sheer number of other candidates being proposed. The voting went on for 57 rounds, with little to no changes in the delegate count. It was at this point that the convention utterly broke down. A group of deep Southern delegates wanted the convention to adopt a firm stance, saying that it would allow slavery into the new territories as a guarantee. Douglas, one of the leaders in the popular sovereignty movement, which said if people didn't want slavery, allowed new territories to become free states instead, rejected this demand. This led to a massive walkout of delegates from the 11 deep Southern states, which, by no coincidence, would all be part of the Confederacy. These delegates would reconvene 2 months later in Richmond, Virginia, where they would nominate John C. Breckinridge, the vice president at the time, for president. This man stood not only on a platform of extending slavery into all new territories, but also into territories that had already voted against slavery. He was also a secessionist who claimed that if anyone bar him was elected, that he would encourage the secession of any slave states. While this was happening, the remaining Democrats carried on the convention after moving to Baltimore without the deep Southern delegates, and eventually nominated Douglas for president. Up north in Chicago, however, the Republicans were running a much more orderly convention that nominated Abraham Lincoln after only 3 ballots. Seeing the contention that merely inter-party nomination was causing, a fourth party popped up. This was the Constitutional Union Party, led by John Bell of Tennessee. The party was a single-issue party that stood for the preservation of the Union at all costs, no matter the compromises that would have to be forced through. The election itself was bizarre. In traditional 19th century political style, neither Lincoln nor Bell nor Breckinridge would make any sort of public appearance, leaving the job of campaigning up to local party machines. However, Douglas took a different route, deciding to go on a whistle-stop tour around the country to try and drum up support for the Northern Democrats. He ran what has been described by many historians as the first modern election campaign, with stump speeches and meetings in town halls and trying to get true nationwide support. In addition, many southern states didn't even bother to put Lincoln on the ballot, and vice versa for many northern states in Breckinridge. As said before, the only candidate trying to get true national appeal was Douglas, and even then he didn't bother campaigning in the Republican stronghold in New England or the Southern Democratic strongholds of Alabama and Mississippi. The election was confused further by the addition of the Constitutional Union Party, which mainly campaigned in border states, such as Kentucky, Maryland, Virginia, Missouri, and Tennessee, that had the most to lose from any civil war, as the Civil War would be on their land. In the end, the election was, as expected, a highly regionalized affair. All the free states voting for Lincoln, all the border states, bar Maryland and Missouri, voting for Bell, and the South and Maryland voting for Breckinridge. Douglas, despite winning almost a third of the popular vote due to his nationwide campaign, only managed to win Missouri outright and a few delegates from New Jersey. This is where the country really started to collapse. South Carolina, outraged at Lincoln winning the election without the support of the southern states, and fearful that he would start to abolish slavery, secedes from the Union to become the Republic of South Carolina, and urges other southern states to join it. For a time, these calls are ignored, with many southern states trying to overturn Lincoln's election without secession through various methods, including protests and an attempt at a court case. However, 2 months before Lincoln was to be inaugurated, 6 other southern states separated. These were Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. These would be known as the states of the Deep South, and would form the heartland of the Confederacy. They would convene in Montgomery, Alabama, and declare themselves the Confederate States of America. During this period, both Virginia and Tennessee had secession conventions that stated that peace would prevail in their states and that they would remain part of the Union. However, after the inauguration of Lincoln, he did 2 things that would radicalize the southern states against him. Firstly, he called for volunteers from the North to fight against the Confederacy. This made many southern states scared of how far Lincoln would go and pushed them away from his camp. There was also the first military action of the war, the shelling of Fort Sumter, in which the South managed to capture a Union fort in Charleston Harbor without any casualties. This showed to many states that were on the fence the strength of the Confederacy. It was after these 2 events that Tennessee, Virginia, Arkansas, and North Carolina would leave the Union. These would be the final 4 states to leave. The Confederacy would later claim that Kentucky and Missouri had left the Union. However, at no point did their legislatures ever vote for this. The Confederacy then moved their capital to Richmond, Virginia, and the war began in earnest. While in the end the Civil War had been building for some time, it was the election of 1860 that was the immediate cause. It was the threat of a Northerner who was really committed to trying to fight for slavery being elected that meant the South felt so certain that they believed their only recourse was to leave the Union entirely to try and preserve slavery. This proves the fact that the election of 1860 was an integral reason for the start of the Civil War. Thanks for listening to this episode of my podcast. I'll have more on this topic and others in weeks to come. Bye.